The silence in my kitchen was deafening as I stared at the empty spot where my antique hope chest had sat for 37 years. That beautiful mahogany chest that my late husband Bill had crafted with his own hands, filled with our most precious memories, was gone. Jessica had donated it to charity while I was visiting my sister Carol in Cincinnati, claiming it was cluttering their newly renovated townhouse. What she didn't bother to mention until I discovered its absence was that inside that chest were my original wedding photos, the only copies that existed of the most important day of my life with the man I'd loved for 28 years before cancer took him away. They were just old pictures taking up space, Maggie, Jessica had said with that dismissive wave of her manicured hand when I confronted her. We live in the digital age now. Besides, the chest didn't match our aesthetic. Just like that, 40 years of memories reduced to clutter that didn't fit her minimalist vision. The woman my son Danny had married 3 years ago had just erased the visual history of my marriage, my family, my entire life before she entered it, and she seemed genuinely confused by my distress. That was the moment I realized that Jessica Chin Thompson didn't just dislike me, she was systematically removing me from my own son's life, one memory at a time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie, and at 58 years old, I thought I understood my place in the world. I'm the mother who raised an incredible son mostly on my own after my husband Bill passed away from lung cancer when Danny was just 15. I'm the woman who worked double shifts at Bradley Insurance Agency to put Danny through college at Ohio State. I'm the widow who learned to fix leaky faucets and change car oil because there was no one else to do it. For 43 years, I'd lived in the same Victorian house on Maple Street in Riverside, Ohio, watching the neighborhood change around me while I remained the constant, reliable presence my son could always count on. Bill and I had bought that house as newlyweds in 1985, drawn to its original hardwood floors, bay windows, and the large backyard where we dreamed of raising children. Bill was a carpenter by trade, a gentle man with calloused hands and an infectious laugh who could build anything from scratch. He'd spent our first year of marriage renovating that house room by room, putting his love into every custom shelf, every restored doorframe, every carefully chosen fixture. The hope chest where he stored our wedding photos was his first anniversary gift to me, carved from a single piece of mahogany with intricate roses along the edges and lined with cedar to protect whatever treasures I chose to keep inside. Those weren't just photographs that Jessica had thrown away, they were irreplaceable moments frozen in time. My wedding dress that my mother had sewn by hand, captured in those pictures, showing the careful detail work she'd spent months perfecting. Bill's nervous smile as we exchanged vows in the small chapel at St. Matthew's Community Church, his hands shaking slightly as he slipped the simple gold band onto my finger. The candid shots of our families dancing together at the reception. In the church basement, my father spinning my mother around the floor one last time before his arthritis made dancing impossible. Pictures of Bill's parents, who had passed away years before Danny was even born, leaving those photographs as the only visual connection my son had to his paternal grandparents. The chest had also contained other irreplaceable items that Jessica apparently deemed unworthy of her sleek, modern aesthetic. Danny's first tooth, carefully preserved in a tiny envelope labeled in my careful handwriting. The hospital bracelet from the day he was born, when Bill had paced the waiting room for 14 hours before finally meeting his son. Letters Bill had written to me during our brief separation early in our marriage when his drinking had gotten out of control and he'd gone to stay with his brother in Toledo while attending AA meetings. Those letters, filled with promises and apologies and declarations of love, had documented his journey back to sobriety and to our family. Love notes he'd left in my lunch bag during the lean years when he was building his carpentry business. And I was working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Every report card Danny had ever received, every school photo from kindergarten through high school graduation, every Father's Day card he'd made with construction paper and glue sticks was in that chest. The program from Bill's funeral, the condolence cards from neighbors and friends, the final letter he'd written to Danny to be opened on his wedding day, all of it gone to some charity shop where strangers would rifle through the remnants of my life and discard what they didn't find valuable. When I'd married Bill Thompson, I was 21 years old and working as a receptionist at the local dentist's office. Bill was 23, had just started his carpentry apprenticeship, and was the kindest man I'd ever met. He'd noticed me at the hardware store where I was trying to figure out how to fix a broken cabinet door in my tiny apartment, and he'd spent 20 minutes explaining different types of hinges with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted to help. 3 months later, he asked me to dinner at the Garden Terrace, Riverside's fanciest restaurant, though I later learned he'd had to work overtime for 2 weeks to afford it. Our courtship was simple but genuine. Bill would pick me up after work in his beat-up Ford pickup truck, and we'd drive around the countryside talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams of starting his own construction company, of building beautiful homes for families like the one he hoped we'd have someday. I shared my modest ambitions of maybe taking some college courses, of seeing more of the world beyond Riverside, of creating a stable, loving home unlike the chaotic household I'd grown up in where my father's temper and my mother's anxiety had created constant tension. When Bill proposed 6 months later, it wasn't with an elaborate surprise or expensive ring. He'd simply taken my hand during one of our evening walks around Riverside Park and said, "Maggie, I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me and build something beautiful together?" The ring was a modest diamond solitaire. That had belonged to his grandmother, but it represented everything I wanted: commitment, stability, and a partnership with someone who saw me as essential to his happiness. Our wedding was small but perfect. My mother had insisted on making my dress herself, staying up late for weeks to hand-sew the delicate lace details and tiny pearl buttons. Bill's best man was his younger brother Tom, who'd driven down from Detroit for the ceremony. My maid of honor was my sister Carol, who'd helped me do my hair in the church bathroom and whispered encouragement when I'd gotten nervous before walking down the aisle. The reception featured my aunt's famous lasagna, a cake from the local bakery decorated with simple white roses, and dancing to records played on the church's ancient sound system. What made those photos precious wasn't their professional quality. We'd hired Riverside's only wedding photographer, a sweet elderly man named Mr. Garcia who charged a fraction of what photographers cost today, but the genuine joy captured in every frame. Bill's face when he first saw me in my dress, the way his eyes lit up with wonder and love. My grandmother crying happy tears during the ceremony, knowing it would likely be her last family wedding. The candid shot of Bill and me laughing during our first dance when he accidentally stepped on my dress and nearly sent us both tumbling. Those photographs had documented not just a wedding but the beginning of a life together that, while not always easy, had been filled with genuine love and mutual respect. When Danny was born 2 years later, after we'd suffered through a miscarriage that had tested our faith and our marriage, those wedding photos took on even greater significance. They represented the foundation upon which we'd built our family, the promise we'd made to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Bill had been an involved father from the moment Danny took his first breath. He'd insisted on changing diapers, getting up for middle-of-the-night feedings, and taking Danny to the park every Saturday morning so I could have a few hours to myself. When Danny was learning to walk, Bill had spent an entire weekend baby-proofing the house, covering every sharp corner and securing every cabinet door. He'd built Danny a treehouse in our backyard when our son turned 7, complete with a rope ladder and a small platform where Danny could sit and read his books in peace. The three of us had fallen into comfortable routines that made our house feel like a true home. Sunday morning pancakes with Bill flipping them high in the air while Danny and I cheered from the kitchen table. Saturday afternoon projects where Bill would teach Danny how to use tools safely while I worked in the garden Bill had planted for me behind the house. Family game nights where we'd play Monopoly or Scrabble while eating popcorn and listening to the radio. Simple pleasures that created the secure, loving environment I'd always dreamed of providing for my children. When Danny was 14, Bill started complaining about persistent fatigue and a cough that wouldn't go away. Being a typical man, he dismissed it as just getting older, working too hard, maybe coming down with something. It took months of my nagging before he finally agreed to see Dr. Patterson, our family physician, who immediately ordered chest x-rays and referred Bill to an oncologist in Columbus. The diagnosis was stage 3 lung cancer, aggressive and already spreading despite the fact that Bill had never smoked a single cigarette in his life. The next year was a blur of chemotherapy treatments, radiation sessions, and increasingly desperate hope that the next scan would show improvement. Bill fought with everything he had, determined to see Danny graduate from high school, to walk him down the aisle someday, to meet the grandchildren he'd already started planning to spoil. But cancer doesn't negotiate with hope or love or the desperate prayers of a wife who can't imagine life without her partner. Bill passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months before Danny's high school graduation. I'd been sleeping in the chair beside his hospital bed for 6 days, holding his hand and talking to him about all the memories we'd created together. The last thing he said to me was, "Take care of our boy, Maggie. Make sure he knows how proud I am of the man he's becoming." Those words sustained me through the funeral arrangements, through the overwhelming sympathy casseroles from neighbors, through the impossible task of explaining to a 15-year-old boy that his hero wasn't coming home. Danny had taken his father's death as hard as I'd expected, but he'd also shown remarkable strength and maturity in the months that followed. He'd helped me sort through Bill's workshop, carefully organizing tools I had no idea how to use but couldn't bear to get rid of. He'd taken over the lawn mowing and snow shoveling without being asked, stepping into the role of man of the house with a seriousness that broke my heart. Most importantly, he'd let me grieve openly, holding me when I cried and never making me feel like I needed to be stronger than I was capable of being. The insurance money from Bill's life insurance policy was enough to pay off our mortgage and set aside funds for Danny's college education, but it couldn't fill the emotional void his absence had created. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd wake up every morning expecting to smell coffee brewing and hear Bill humming in the shower, only to remember that those simple domestic pleasures were gone forever. I'd find myself setting the table for 3 people or buying Bill's favorite cereal out of habit, small reminders that my life had been fundamentally altered in ways I was still learning to navigate. Danny and I grew even closer during those difficult years. He'd sit with me in the evenings while I looked through photo albums, sharing memories of his father and asking questions about their relationship that helped me process my own grief. He'd accompany me to the cemetery every month when I'd bring fresh flowers to Bill's grave, standing quietly while I talked to his father about Danny's latest accomplishments and my hopes for his future. Those shared moments of remembrance became precious to both of us, a way of keeping Bill's presence alive in our daily lives. When Danny left for Ohio State University, I'd been proud but devastated. The house felt impossibly quiet without his teenage energy filling the rooms, without his friends stopping by for dinner or help with homework. I'd thrown myself into work at Bradley Insurance Agency, taking on extra responsibilities and working longer hours to avoid coming home to an empty house. My coworkers had been patient with my adjustment period, understanding that becoming an empty nester widow required its own grieving process. Danny had thrived in college, majoring in business administration and joining the campus community in ways that made both Bill and me proud. He'd called home every Sunday evening, sharing stories about his classes, his friends, and eventually, his romantic relationships. When he'd started dating seriously during his junior year, I'd been excited to hear about the young women who'd captured his interest, hoping that someday I'd have the joy of welcoming a daughter-in-law into our family. Jessica Chen had entered Danny's life during his senior year at Ohio State, a marketing major from an affluent family in Columbus who seemed sophisticated and ambitious in ways that impressed my son. During their early phone conversations, Danny had described her as smart, driven, and different from anyone he'd ever dated. She came from money, he'd explained, but she wasn't spoiled or entitled. Her father was a prominent cardiologist, her mother was a successful real estate agent, and Jessica herself had already landed a prestigious internship with a marketing firm in Columbus. When Danny had first brought Jessica home to meet me during spring break of his senior year, I'd been nervous but excited. I'd spent days preparing his favorite meals, cleaning the house until every surface gleamed, and arranging fresh flowers from my garden in the guest bedroom where Jessica would be staying. I'd wanted to make a good first impression on the woman who might become my daughter-in-law, to show her the love and warmth that had shaped Danny into the man she'd fallen in love with. Jessica had been polite during that first visit, complimenting my cooking and admiring the house, but I'd sensed a distance that had nothing to do with normal nervousness about meeting a boyfriend's mother. She'd seemed uncomfortable with the lived-in quality of our home, the family photos covering every available surface, the eclectic mix of furniture accumulated over decades of married life. When I'd shown her the photo albums documenting Danny's childhood, she'd flipped through them quickly with what seemed like polite disinterest rather than genuine curiosity about the man she claimed to love. During that weekend visit, I'd noticed subtle ways that Jessica had tried to direct conversations away from family history and toward future plans. When I'd shared stories about Bill and Danny's relationship, she'd changed the subject to career opportunities or travel plans. When Danny had mentioned traditions we'd maintained since his father's death, like our monthly cemetery visits or our annual camping trip to Lake Haven, Jessica had suggested alternative activities that might be more enjoyable for everyone. At the time, I'd chalked up her discomfort to the natural awkwardness of navigating a new relationship dynamic, but looking back, I could see the early signs of someone who viewed our family's past as an obstacle to her vision of their future. The engagement had happened 6 months after graduation, with Jessica showing me her engagement ring during a brief visit home for Thanksgiving. The ring was stunning, a 2-carat princess-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones and a platinum setting that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Jessica had been excited to plan the wedding, though she'd made it clear from the beginning that she envisioned something much more elaborate than the simple ceremony Bill and I had shared. Their wedding had taken place at the Columbus Country Club, a venue that required a guest list limited to immediate family and close friends due to its exclusivity and Jessica's parents' social standing. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue suit. I'd purchased specifically for the occasion, and had felt proud but out of place among Jessica's family's affluent friends and colleagues. The ceremony itself had been beautiful but impersonal, lacking the intimate warmth that had characterized my own wedding. During the reception, I'd found myself sitting at a table with Danny's college friends while Jessica's extended family occupied the more prominent seats near the head table. After the wedding, Danny and Jessica had moved into their new townhouse in Willowbrook Estates, a modern development on the outskirts of Riverside that catered to young professionals with substantial incomes. The townhouse itself was gorgeous, all clean lines and neutral colors, but it felt more like a showroom than a home. Jessica had decorated it herself, choosing furniture and accessories that created a sophisticated but cold atmosphere where everything matched perfectly but nothing revealed anything personal about the people who lived there. I'd visited the townhouse regularly during their first year of marriage, bringing homemade meals and small gifts, trying to maintain the close relationship Danny and I had always shared. But gradually, I'd begun to notice changes in my son that concerned me. He seemed more subdued during our conversations, less likely to share personal details about his work or his marriage. When I'd ask about his happiness or his plans for the future, he'd give generic responses that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Most troubling was his apparent adoption of Jessica's dismissive attitude toward our family traditions and shared history. The first major incident had occurred during their second Christmas as a married couple, when Jessica had announced that they'd be spending the holiday with her parents in Columbus rather than maintaining our tradition of Christmas dinner at my house. Danny had seemed uncomfortable making the announcement, but he'd supported Jessica's decision even when I'd pointed out that this would be the first Christmas since Bill's death that we wouldn't be together. It's important to Jessica that we split our time equally between both families, he'd explained, though I'd noticed that equal time somehow always seemed to favor Jessica's preferences over mine. The gradual erosion of my relationship with Danny had been subtle but persistent. Phone calls became less frequent and shorter in duration. Visits to my house were often accompanied by Jessica, who would fidget impatiently when Danny and I talked about shared memories or inside jokes from his childhood. When I'd suggest activities that Danny and I had always enjoyed together, like hiking at the state park or working in my garden, Jessica would propose alternative plans that involved expensive restaurants or shopping trips that made me feel financially inadequate and socially uncomfortable. The most painful changes had involved the complete elimination of traditions that had sustained Danny and me through the difficult years after Bill's death. Our monthly visits to Bill's grave had stopped entirely after Jessica had commented that dwelling on the past wasn't healthy for Danny's emotional growth. Our annual camping trip to Lake Haven, where Bill had taught Danny to fish and where we'd scattered some of Bill's ashes, was replaced with resort vacations that Jessica planned and her parents partially funded. Even simple traditions like Sunday dinner at my house became irregular events that happened only when Jessica had no other social obligations. I'd tried to address these changes directly with Danny, expressing my concerns about losing touch with each other and my confusion about Jessica's apparent discomfort with our family's history. But Danny had become defensive, insisting that Jessica was simply trying to help him move forward with his life rather than remaining stuck in the past. "Mom, you have to understand that Jessica comes from a different background," he'd explained during one particularly difficult conversation. "Her family doesn't dwell on sad things or spend time talking about people who are gone. She's trying to help me focus on building our future together instead of constantly looking backward." The irony of Danny's explanation hadn't been lost on me. The woman who claimed to be helping him move forward had systematically cut him off from the very foundations that had shaped him into the man she'd supposedly fallen in love with. She'd erased not just my presence from their lives but also the memory of his father, the influence of his upbringing, and the values that had guided him through his first 25 years of life. In Jessica's version of their future, Danny's history began the day he met her, as if nothing that had happened before that moment had any value or relevance to the man he was becoming. The donation of my hope chest had been the culmination of months of smaller erasures that I'd tried to ignore or rationalize away. First, it had been the removal of family photos from Danny and Jessica's refrigerator because they didn't match the kitchen's aesthetic. Then it was the replacement of furniture I'd given them as housewarming gifts with pieces Jessica had chosen herself. Gradually, every trace of our family's presence had been eliminated from their home until it became clear that Jessica was creating a space where I was not welcome and our shared history had no place. When I discovered the missing hope chest, I'd driven immediately to their townhouse, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. Jessica had answered the door in yoga clothes, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking genuinely surprised by my unannounced visit. When I'd asked about the chest, she'd seemed confused by my distress, explaining matter-of-factly that she'd donated it along with several other items that didn't fit their decorating scheme. "I assumed it was just old furniture," she'd said. with that trademark shrug that had become her response to any criticism. Danny said it was something his father made, but it really didn't work with our living room design. We needed the space for the new entertainment center I ordered. When I'd asked about the contents, Jessica had looked genuinely blank. Contents? Oh, you mean those old photo albums and papers? I assumed they were duplicates of things you had at your house. I didn't think anyone would want that old stuff. That old stuff. 40 years of my life, the documented history of my marriage and my son's childhood, the irreplaceable evidence of a love story that had shaped both of our lives, dismissed as old stuff that no one would want. Standing in Jessica's pristine living room, surrounded by furniture that cost more than I made in a year, I'd realized that this wasn't just about photos or a hope chest. This was about a woman who couldn't tolerate the existence of any love story that predated her own, who couldn't share Danny with the mother who'd raised him or the memory of the father who'd adored him. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't accidentally thrown away my wedding photos. She deliberately eliminated every tangible reminder that Danny had a life, a family, and a history that existed independently of her influence. In her mind, she was creating the perfect life for them both, but that perfection required the complete erasure of everything and everyone that had made Danny who he was before she met him. Standing in that sterile townhouse, looking at the empty space where my hope chest had sat for barely 2 weeks before being deemed unworthy of Jessica's vision, I'd made a decision that would change everything. If Jessica wanted to throw away my perfect memories, then perhaps it was time for me to throw away her perfect life. But I wouldn't do it with the cruel impulsiveness she'd shown when disposing of irreplaceable family treasures. I would do it with the same careful planning and attention to detail that had allowed me to build a life worth documenting in the first place. The war for my son's soul had begun, and Jessica Thompson had no idea what she'd started when she decided that 40 years of my life weren't worth the storage space in her perfect home. The drive home from Danny and Jessica's townhouse passed in a blur of tears and rage that left me gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. I pulled into my driveway on Maple Street and sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the Victorian house that suddenly felt like a museum of memories that only I cared to preserve. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surrounded by 40 years of accumulated love while my son was living in a sterile showcase where nothing personal was allowed to exist. Inside my kitchen, I poured myself a glass of the wine Bill and I had been saving for a special occasion, a bottle of Merlot we'd bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Napa Valley. There would never be a special occasion for Bill and me now, and drinking it alone felt like the perfect metaphor for how Jessica had made me feel about every cherished memory I'd tried to share with my son. I called my sister Carol in Cincinnati, knowing I needed to hear a familiar voice before I did something I might regret. She threw away my wedding photos, Carol, I said without preamble when she answered. All of them. The only copies that existed. Bill's hope chest, everything inside it, donated to charity like it was garage sale junk. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Carol finally spoke, her voice was tight, with controlled fury. Please tell me you're joking, Maggie. Please tell me that woman didn't actually throw away irreplaceable family photographs. When I confirmed that Jessica had indeed disposed of 40 years of documented memories without a second thought, Carol unleashed a string of words I hadn't heard since we were teenagers sneaking cigarettes behind our parents' garage. That manipulative little witch knew exactly what she was doing. Nobody accidentally throws away someone else's wedding photos. Carol's validation of my anger felt like permission to stop questioning my own reaction. For the past 3 hours, I'd been wondering if I was overreacting, if perhaps Jessica really had thought the photos were duplicates, if my emotional attachment to physical objects was somehow unhealthy or excessive. But Carol's outrage confirmed what my heart already knew. This had been a deliberate act of cruelty disguised as interior decorating. What are you going to do about it? Carol asked, and I could hear the protective big sister tone that had gotten her into trouble throughout our childhood. Because if you want me to drive down there and explain to Little Miss Perfect why throwing away family heirlooms is unacceptable behavior, I can be there in 4 hours. The offer was tempting, but I knew this was something I needed to handle myself. I'm going to make her understand exactly what she's taken from me, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. But I'm not going to do it by screaming or throwing accusations. I'm going to do it by showing her that actions have consequences, and that some things can't be replaced once they're gone. Carol was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of my words. Maggie, whatever you're thinking, be careful. Jessica has Danny wrapped around her finger, and if you push too hard, you might lose him completely. The warning was valid, but I was beginning to realize that I'd already lost Danny in every way that mattered. The son who'd once spent hours Listening to stories about his father, who'd helped me plant memorial roses in our garden, who'd understood that preserving memories was a way of honoring love, was gone. In his place was a man who'd allowed his wife to erase his own history because it didn't match her aesthetic preferences. After ending the call with Carol, I walked through my house with new eyes, seeing it as Jessica must have seen it during her brief visits. Every surface held photographs spanning decades of life, Danny's school pictures arranged chronologically on the mantel, vacation snapshots covering the refrigerator, candid family moments displayed on end tables and bookshelves. The living room still contained the furniture Bill and I had chosen together, pieces that weren't fashionable but were comfortable and filled with memories of quiet evenings reading together, of Danny doing homework at the coffee table while we watched television. In the basement, Bill's workshop remained exactly as he'd left it, tools hanging in organized rows on pegboard walls, half-finished projects sitting on his workbench waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. I'd kept the workshop intact partly as a shrine to Bill's memory and partly because Danny had always said he wanted to learn carpentry someday, to connect with his father's craft and perhaps build furniture for his own children. Now I realized that Jessica would never allow such a messy, impractical hobby to intrude on their perfectly curated lifestyle. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I opened a bottle of white wine and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, not to write a letter or plan a confrontation, but to create an inventory of everything Jessica had cost me. The list started with the obvious losses, the hope chest Bill had made, the wedding photographs that could never be replaced, the documentation of Danny's childhood that had been reduced to charity shop donations. But as I continued writing, other losses became apparent. Christmas traditions that had been abandoned because they didn't fit Jessica's sophisticated vision of holiday celebrations. Sunday dinners that had dwindled to rare, awkward occasions because Jessica found my cooking too simple and my conversation too focused on the past. Camping trips to Lake Haven that had been replaced with resort vacations I couldn't afford to join. Most painfully, the gradual erosion of my relationship with Danny himself, as Jessica systematically trained him to view our shared history as an obstacle to his personal growth rather than the foundation that had shaped him into a man worth loving. The realization that struck me most forcefully was that Jessica hadn't just thrown away my wedding photos, she'd been throwing away pieces of my relationship with Danny for 3 years, one tradition at a time. Each cancelled visit, each declined invitation, each suggestion that it was time for Danny to stop dwelling on the past had been another item donated to the charity of Jessica's convenience. I'd been watching my son disappear into someone else's vision of who he should be, and I'd done nothing to stop it because I'd been afraid of being labeled the interfering mother-in-law. Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked, patterns that revealed the systematic nature of Jessica's campaign to remake Danny according to her specifications. During our weekly phone calls, Danny mentioned casually that he'd decided to sell his father's old pickup truck because it wasn't practical for their lifestyle. The truck had been Bill's pride and joy, a 1989 Ford F-150 that he'd restored himself and had planned to pass down to Danny as a symbol of the Thompson men's shared love of honest work and practical skills. When I asked Danny why he was selling the truck, he gave me the same rehearsed explanation I'd been hearing for months. Jessica thinks it's time for me to let go of things that tie me to the past. She says I can't move forward if I'm constantly surrounded by reminders of Dad. The words sounded so unlike my son that I wondered if Jessica had been coaching him on what to say during our conversations. Danny, I said carefully, that truck represents more than just transportation. It's a connection to your father's values, his work ethic, his belief that things should be built to last. Are you sure you want to give that up? There was a long pause before Danny responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that gave me hope. Maybe I'm being too hasty, he admitted. It's just that Jessica gets upset when she sees me working on it in the garage. She says the smell of motor oil and the noise of tools makes her anxious, and she doesn't understand why I want to spend time on something so old when we could afford to buy something newer and more reliable. The explanation revealed everything I needed to know about how Jessica viewed her husband's interests and autonomy. That conversation prompted me to call my friend Linda Martinez, who'd been my closest confidant since Bill's death and who had no patience for people who tried to control others through emotional manipulation. Linda was a retired social worker who'd spent 30 years helping people recognize and escape unhealthy relationship dynamics, and she'd been expressing concerns about Jessica's influence on Danny since their engagement. Maggie, what you're describing isn't normal newlywed adjustment, Linda said after I'd explained Jessica's systematic elimination of family traditions and personal connections. This is classic isolation behavior. She's cutting Danny off from everything and everyone that predates their relationship, making herself the center of his universe by removing all other sources of identity and support. Linda's professional assessment confirmed my growing suspicions about Jessica's motivations. The wedding photos weren't an accident, and neither was the timing. She waited until you were out of town to donate that hope chest because she knew you'd try to stop her if you'd been here. She's testing boundaries, seeing how much she can get away with before Danny or you push back. And since nobody has challenged her yet, she's escalating. The conversation with Linda crystallized something that had been forming in my mind since discovering the missing hope chest. I'd spent 3 years trying to accommodate Jessica's preferences, making myself smaller and less intrusive in hopes of maintaining a relationship with my son. But accommodation hadn't preserved our connection, it had simply enabled Jessica to remove me from Danny's life more efficiently. The time for polite deference was over. I began documenting everything, keeping a detailed record of Jessica's comments and actions that I'd previously dismissed as personality quirks or minor irritations. The way she'd redirected conversations whenever I tried to share stories about Danny's childhood. Her habit of scheduling activities during times when Danny and I had standing plans together. The subtle but consistent criticism of my cooking, my home, my clothes, and my interests that had gradually made me feel unwelcome in my own son's life. Most revealing was a pattern I'd failed to recognize until I wrote it down. Jessica had never once asked me about Bill, about our marriage, or about what Danny had been like as a child. For someone who claimed to love my son, she showed remarkably little curiosity about the experiences that had shaped him. Instead, she seemed determined to create a version of Danny that had no history before their meeting, no attachments that might compete with her influence, no identity that existed independently of their relationship. The breakthrough moment came during a conversation with Tom Bradley, my boss at the insurance agency, who'd known Danny since he was a teenager and had watched him grow into a responsible, thoughtful young man. Tom had been asking about Danny's marriage and expressing concern about how rarely he'd seen him around town since the wedding. That boy used to stop by the office at least once a month when he was home from college, Tom mused during our lunch break. He'd ask about the business, talk about his classes, tell stories about his father that always made you smile. I haven't seen him in over a year now. How's he adjusting to married life? The question forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. Danny wasn't adjusting to married life so much as he was disappearing into it. The confident, engaging young man who'd balanced respect for family traditions with enthusiasm for new experiences had been replaced by someone who seemed uncomfortable with his own history and defensive about his wife's preferences. Jessica hadn't just married Danny, she'd begun the process of remaking him entirely. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the week after Bill's funeral. I went to the cemetery alone, without the monthly ritual that had included Danny for so many years. Sitting beside Bill's grave in the fading light, I found myself talking to my deceased husband about the crisis facing our son. "She's trying to erase you, Bill," I whispered to the headstone. "She's convinced Danny that holding on to memories of you is somehow unhealthy, that moving forward means cutting ties with everything that came before. I don't know how to fight this without losing him completely, but I can't watch her destroy the man we raised together." As if Bill were somehow guiding my thoughts, a plan began forming in my mind. Jessica valued perfection, control, and the appearance of sophisticated success above all else. She'd built her identity around being the woman who'd transformed Danny into her ideal partner, who'd created the perfect modern marriage free from the messy complications of extended family and emotional baggage. What if that perfect image could be threatened? What if the carefully constructed life she'd built for them both could be revealed as the fragile facade it actually was? I spent the following week researching Jessica's background more thoroughly than I ever had before, paying attention to details I'd previously considered unimportant. Her parents' real estate business had been struggling since the market downturn, despite their efforts to maintain appearances of continued success. Her father's medical practice was facing increased competition from younger cardiologists who offered more innovative treatments. Most significantly, Jessica's own marketing career was less stable than she'd led everyone to believe. Through a contact at the bank who processed business loans, I learned that Jessica had been laid off from her prestigious marketing position 6 months earlier but had been hiding the job loss from Danny by maintaining her previous schedule and spending patterns. She'd been funding her unemployment through credit cards and family loans, creating the illusion of continued professional success while secretly applying for positions that paid significantly less than her previous salary. The discovery of Jessica's financial deception provided the opening I'd been looking for. If she could throw away irreplaceable family treasures while hiding the fact that she was unemployed and accumulating debt, then perhaps it was time for some uncomfortable truths to be revealed. I began planning a strategy that would expose Jessica's lies without making me appear vindictive or manipulative. My first step was to reconnect with people Jessica had systematically cut from Danny's life. I called Ryan Mitchell, Danny's best friend from college, who'd been inexplicably excluded from their wedding guest list despite having been like a brother to Danny throughout their university years. Ryan was delighted to hear from me and eager to share his own concerns about Danny's transformation since marrying Jessica. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been worried about Danny for months," Ryan admitted during our phone conversation. "He's become so different, so isolated from everyone he used to be close to. Every time I try to make plans with him, Jessica has already scheduled something that conflicts. It's like she doesn't want him to have any relationships that don't include her." Ryan's observations confirmed my suspicions about Jessica's isolation tactics. More importantly, he provided information about Danny's state of mind that I couldn't have obtained through our increasingly superficial phone conversations. He seems stressed all the time now, like he's constantly worried about doing something wrong or disappointing Jessica. The Danny I knew in college was confident and independent. This version of him seems to be walking on eggshells in his own marriage. I also reached out to Dr. Sarah Williams, the grief counselor who'd helped Danny and me process Bill's death and who'd remained a supportive presence in our lives until Jessica had convinced Danny that therapy was an indulgence that prevented him from moving forward. Dr. Williams had been surprised to learn that Danny had stopped their sessions abruptly and had been concerned about the potential impact of unresolved grief on his future relationships. "Healthy grief processing doesn't mean forgetting the deceased or avoiding reminders of them," Dr. Williams explained during our conversation. "It means integrating those memories and relationships into a continuing life story." "From what you're describing, it sounds like Jessica is encouraging Danny to suppress rather than process his relationship with his father's memory, which could create significant emotional problems over time." Armed with professional validation of my concerns and evidence of Jessica's financial deceptions, I began implementing a plan that would force her to confront the consequences of her actions. But unlike her impulsive destruction of irreplaceable family treasures, my response would be measured, strategic, and designed to create maximum impact on the perfect life she'd worked so hard to construct. The first phase involved what I privately called the documentation project. If Jessica could throw away the photographic evidence of my family's history, then perhaps it was time for me to create a comprehensive record of her attempts to isolate and manipulate my son. I began keeping detailed notes of every conversation, every canceled plan, every instance of Jessica redirecting Danny away from family connections. I saved every email and text message that revealed her systematic efforts to control his social calendar and limit his contact with people who'd known him before their marriage. More importantly, I began reaching out to mutual acquaintances who might have information about Jessica's current employment status and financial situation. Through careful questioning disguised as friendly interest, I confirmed that Jessica had indeed been unemployed for 6 months and was funding her lifestyle through increasingly desperate measures. The woman who'd thrown away my family's history because it didn't match her aesthetic preferences was living a lie that could collapse at any moment. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Jessica had destroyed genuine treasures to make room for a fake perfect life built on deception and debt. She'd sacrificed authenticity for appearance, substance for style, and in doing so, she'd created vulnerabilities that a more experienced woman could exploit with devastating effectiveness. As I prepared to move into the next phase of my plan, I felt a strange combination of sadness and determination. I was about to wage war against my daughter-in-law not because I enjoyed conflict, but because she'd left me no choice. By throwing away my wedding photos, Jessica had declared that my love story, my family's history, and my role in Danny's life were expendable obstacles to her vision of perfection. Now it was time for her to learn that some things, once destroyed, could never be replaced. The perfect life she'd built for herself was about to become as fragile and temporary as the photographs she'd so carelessly discarded. But unlike her cruel impulsiveness, my response would be patient, methodical, and designed to teach her a lesson about the true cost of destroying things that others held precious. The war for my son's soul was about to begin in earnest, and Jessica Thompson had no idea what she'd unleashed when she decided that 40 years of my memories weren't worth preserving. The first public crack in Jessica's perfect facade appeared at the Riverside Community Center's annual charity auction, an event I'd attended for 15 years and where Jessica had insisted on making her social debut as Danny's wife. She'd purchased a new designer dress for the occasion, something that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and had spent weeks preparing what she called her networking strategy for connecting with Riverside's most influential families. I arrived at the auction early, as I always did, to help Linda Martinez with the registration table. Linda had been organizing this event for a decade, and she knew every family's financial situation, social dynamics, and personal dramas better than most people knew their own neighbors. When Jessica swept into the community center wearing her expensive dress and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than some people's cars, Linda raised an eyebrow and murmured, "Someone's trying awfully hard to make an impression." Jessica made a point of introducing herself to everyone she considered socially relevant, dropping casual mentions of her father's medical practice, her mother's real estate success, and her own marketing career with the confidence of someone who'd never had her credentials questioned. She bid aggressively on several high-ticket items, including a weekend getaway package to a luxury resort and an expensive piece of artwork donated by a local gallery owner. Each bid was announced with a bright smile and a casual comment about how she and Danny needed to expand their art collection for their beautiful new home. What Jessica didn't realize was that Linda had done her homework. During a quiet moment between auction items, Linda leaned over and whispered, "Your daughter-in-law is certainly spending freely for someone who's been unemployed for 6 months." The observation sent a chill down my spine, not because I was surprised by Jessica's deception, but because I realized how public her financial recklessness was becoming. The turning point came when Jessica bid $1,500 on a handcrafted dining room set donated by Peterson's Furniture, a local business that had been struggling since the economic downturn. The bid was significantly higher than the set's retail value, and it drew surprised looks from several longtime residents who understood the local economy well enough to recognize unnecessary extravagance. When the auctioneer asked for her payment method, Jessica confidently handed over a credit card, apparently unaware that her theatrical generosity was creating exactly the kind of attention she couldn't afford. Danny appeared uncomfortable throughout the evening, though he tried to support Jessica's enthusiastic participation in the auction. I watched him wince slightly when she made particularly expensive bids, and I noticed him checking his phone repeatedly with the distracted air of someone monitoring bank balances or credit card limits. The confident young man who'd once managed his college finances responsibly seemed to have developed the nervous habits of someone living beyond his means. After the auction, I approached Dr. Richard Patterson, Riverside's longtime family physician, who'd known the Thompson family since Danny was born. Dr. Patterson had been making small talk with several community members about local economic challenges. When Jessica had inserted herself into the conversation with advice about investment strategies and financial planning, the doctor's bemused expression suggested he found her presumptions amusing rather than impressive. "Maggie, that's quite a daughter-in-law you've acquired," Dr. Patterson said with the diplomatic tone he'd perfected during 40 years of managing delicate social situations. "She certainly has strong opinions about financial matters for someone so young." The comment was neutral enough to avoid direct criticism, but I understood the subtext. Jessica's financial advice had been either naive or inappropriate for the circumstances. The conversation gave me an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt about Jessica's expertise without appearing vindictive or gossipy. "Jessica's still adjusting to small-town life," I replied carefully. "She comes from a more affluent background in Columbus, so sometimes her perspective doesn't quite fit our local situation." The explanation was charitable enough to avoid accusations of disloyalty while subtly suggesting that Jessica's confidence might be misplaced. Over the following weeks, I began what I privately called my truth-telling campaign, a careful process of allowing Jessica's lies to reveal themselves through natural social interactions. When neighbors asked about Danny's marriage or Jessica's career, I provided honest but diplomatic responses that neither defended her deceptions nor explicitly exposed them. Instead, I simply refrained from reinforcing the false narratives she'd been promoting about their financial stability and professional success. The strategy proved more effective than direct confrontation would have been. When Mrs. Ruth Patterson mentioned seeing Jessica shopping at expensive boutiques during business hours, I simply acknowledged that Jessica had been between positions recently while exploring new career opportunities. When Tom Bradley asked about Danny's financial planning strategies, given his apparent ability to afford luxury purchases, I suggested he might want to discuss investment approaches directly with my son rather than assuming anything about their current situation. Most importantly, I began reconnecting with community members Jessica had dismissed as unworthy of her attention, people who'd known Danny since childhood and who had their own observations about his transformation since marriage. Margaret Foster, who'd taught Danny in 3rd grade and remembered him as a thoughtful, honest child, expressed concern about his apparent stress levels during their brief encounters at the grocery store. "He always seems to be in such a hurry now," she observed. "And he doesn't make eye contact the way he used to. That boy was raised to be polite and present with people, but lately he acts like he's afraid someone might ask him a question he doesn't want to answer." The observation stung because it accurately described the change I'd noticed in my son but hadn't been able to articulate. Danny had developed the evasive manner of someone living with secrets, constantly monitoring his words and actions to avoid revealing information that might contradict the carefully constructed image Jessica had created for their marriage. The confident, straightforward young man I'd raised had been replaced by someone who seemed perpetually anxious about saying the wrong thing or disappointing the wrong person. My suspicions about Jessica's employment situation were confirmed when I encountered Helen Chen, Jessica's mother, at the bank where I'd gone to discuss refinancing options for some home improvements. Helen looked uncomfortable when she saw me, clearly uncertain about how much information Jessica had shared about her current circumstances. During our awkward conversation, Helen inadvertently revealed that Jessica had been exploring freelance opportunities since leaving her previous position, a euphemism that confirmed my understanding of her unemployment status. More significantly, Helen's demeanor suggested that Jessica's financial situation was becoming a source of family stress. When I mentioned how lovely Jessica had looked at the charity auction, Helen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Jessica has always enjoyed social events, she replied carefully, though we've been encouraging her to be more mindful about discretionary spending while she's transitioning between positions. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying concern about Jessica's continued extravagance despite her lack of income. Armed with this confirmation, I began the second phase of my plan, strategic information sharing that would gradually expose Jessica's deceptions to the people whose opinions mattered most to her social ambitions. Rather than spreading gossip or making accusations, I simply stopped protecting Jessica from the natural consequences of her lies. When community members made assumptions about her employment or financial status based on her own statements, I declined to correct misconceptions that might have preserved her false image. The approach required patience and subtlety, but it proved devastatingly effective. Jessica's credibility began eroding through small incidents that individually seemed insignificant but collectively revealed a pattern of deception and poor judgment. When she offered to organize an expensive fundraising event for the community center despite being unable to commit her own resources, Linda Martinez quietly declined the offer and mentioned the decision to several other board members. When Jessica provided financial advice to younger couples based on investment strategies she claimed to be using successfully, those recommendations were eventually revealed to be theoretical rather than based on actual experience. Most damaging was Jessica's continued pattern of expensive purchases and social commitments that became increasingly difficult to explain as her unemployment stretched longer. The designer clothes, luxury accessories, and costly entertainment choices that had initially impressed people began generating questions about the source of funding for such extravagance. In a small town where most families understood the relationship between income and spending, Jessica's lifestyle choices started appearing either recklessly irresponsible or deliberately deceptive. The pressure began affecting Jessica's behavior in noticeable ways. She became more defensive during social interactions, quicker to take offense at innocent questions, and increasingly isolated from community members who'd initially welcomed her enthusiastically. Her attempts to maintain her sophisticated image while hiding her employment problems created contradictions that observant people couldn't help but notice. Danny bore the brunt of the stress created by Jessica's deteriorating social position. During our increasingly rare phone conversations, he sounded tired and distracted, often cutting calls short with vague explanations about needing to handle some urgent matter. When I suggested meeting for lunch at our usual spot, the corner cafe, he declined with an excuse about being too busy with work projects. The rejection hurt, but it also revealed how completely Jessica had succeeded in isolating him from sources of emotional support outside their marriage. The breaking point came during the community center's monthly potluck dinner, an informal gathering that Jessica had been attending regularly as part of her networking efforts. She arrived wearing another new outfit and carrying an expensive bottle of wine as her contribution to the meal, continuing her pattern of using costly purchases to maintain appearances. But this time, her performance was undermined by Danny's obvious discomfort and distraction throughout the evening. I watched from across the room as Jessica dominated conversations with increasingly desperate attempts to impress people who were beginning to see through her facade. She name-dropped connections that couldn't be verified, described career opportunities that never seemed to materialize, and made financial commitments for future events that everyone understood she couldn't afford to honor. Danny stood beside her, looking increasingly miserable, occasionally attempting to moderate her more outrageous claims but generally appearing trapped in a situation he couldn't control or escape. The most revealing moment came when Jessica volunteered to coordinate the center's upcoming renovation project, confidently promising to secure corporate sponsors and professional contractors through her extensive business network. The offer Was ambitious enough to be impressive if genuine, but several board members exchanged glances that suggested skepticism about Jessica's ability to deliver on such grandiose promises. When Linda Martinez diplomatically suggested that Jessica might want to start with a smaller project to establish her capabilities, Jessica's reaction was swift and defensive. "I think you're underestimating my professional connections," Jessica replied with barely concealed irritation. "I've managed marketing campaigns worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. A simple renovation project wouldn't be challenging for someone with my experience." The response revealed both her arrogance and her desperation to maintain credibility despite mounting evidence of her deceptions. Danny's expression during Jessica's outburst was heartbreaking to witness. He looked embarrassed, frustrated, and completely overwhelmed by his wife's increasingly reckless behavior. When Jessica continued defending her qualifications with examples that couldn't be fact-checked, Danny quietly excused himself from the conversation and walked outside, leaving Jessica to manage the social damage on her own. I followed Danny outside and found him sitting on the community center's front steps with his head in his hands, the picture of a man whose life had become unmanageable. For several minutes, we sat in silence while Danny struggled with emotions he clearly didn't know how to express. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, I don't know what's happening to us," he said without looking up. "Jessica's been acting so strange lately, making promises she can't keep, spending money we don't have, getting angry when I try to discuss our budget. I feel like I'm living with someone I don't recognize anymore." The admission was the first genuine communication we'd had in months, and it gave me hope that my son was beginning to see through the illusions Jessica had created. "Danny, you know you can talk to me about anything," I replied carefully, not wanting to seem like I was attacking Jessica but needing him to understand that he had support available. "Marriage involves adjustments and compromises, but it shouldn't require you to live in constant stress or to compromise your own values and judgment." The response was neutral enough to avoid triggering his defensive instincts while opening the door for honest conversation. Danny raised his head and looked at me with eyes that reminded me of the confused, grieving teenager he'd been after Bill's death. "She's been lying to me, Mom. About her job, about our finances, about things that matter. I found out she's been unemployed for months, but she's been pretending to go to work every day and spending money we can't afford to spend. I don't understand why she couldn't just tell me the truth." The revelation confirmed everything I'd suspected about Jessica's deceptions, but hearing Danny acknowledge the lies was both validating and heartbreaking. My son had been living with someone who'd been systematically deceiving him while simultaneously isolating him from family members who might have provided support and perspective. The magnitude of Jessica's manipulation was becoming clear even to her primary victim. "Why do you think she felt she couldn't be honest with you?" I asked, genuinely curious about Danny's perspective on his wife's behavior. The question seemed to surprise him, as if he'd been so focused on the fact of Jessica's lies that he hadn't considered her possible motivations for maintaining them. "I think she's terrified of not being perfect," Danny said slowly, working through his thoughts aloud. "She puts so much pressure on herself to maintain this image of success and sophistication that she can't admit when things go wrong. But the lies just make everything worse, and now I don't know what else she might be hiding from me." The conversation was interrupted when Jessica emerged from the community center, clearly agitated by whatever interactions had occurred after Danny's departure. Her perfect composure was cracking under the strain of maintaining lies that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. When she saw Danny and me talking quietly together, her expression shifted to the familiar combination of suspicion and resentment that appeared whenever she perceived threats to her control over my son's loyalties. "Danny, we need to leave," Jessica announced without acknowledging my presence. "I have an early morning meeting tomorrow, and I need to prepare my presentation materials tonight." The excuse was delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to having her demands met without question, but Danny's response suggested that his willingness to accommodate her deceptions was beginning to erode. "What meeting, Jessica?" Danny asked with a directness that surprised both women. "You've been unemployed for 6 months. What presentation are you preparing?" The challenge was delivered quietly but firmly, marking what appeared to be the first time Danny had directly confronted his wife's lies rather than enabling them through silence or compliance. Jessica's reaction was swift and defensive, but also revealing in its desperation. "I'm working on several consulting projects that you wouldn't understand because they involve marketing strategies beyond your experience," she snapped. "Just because I don't share every detail of my professional activities doesn't mean I'm unemployed." The response was both condescending and evasive, designed to shame Danny into backing down rather than addressing his legitimate questions about their financial situation. But instead of retreating, Danny stood up and faced his wife with a determination I hadn't seen since his teenage years. "Jessica, I've seen our bank statements. I know about the credit card debt. I know you haven't had a paycheck in months. I'm trying to understand why you've been lying to me instead of letting me help us figure out a solution together." The public nature of the confrontation seemed to shock Jessica into momentary honesty. Looking around to ensure that other community members weren't within hearing distance, she lowered her voice but couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. "I was trying to protect you from worrying about money while I found the right position. I didn't want you to think you'd married someone who couldn't maintain her career." The explanation revealed the insecurity underlying Jessica's elaborate deceptions, but it also highlighted her fundamental misunderstanding of what marriage was supposed to involve. She'd been so focused on maintaining an image of perfection that she'd forgotten that partnerships were supposed to involve mutual support during difficult times, not elaborate performances designed to hide vulnerability from the person who should have been her closest ally. "Protecting me by lying to me isn't protection, Jessica," Danny replied with a sadness that was audible in his voice. "It's manipulation. And spending money we don't have to maintain appearances isn't solving anything. It's making our problems worse while preventing us from addressing them honestly." Standing there in the evening light outside the community center, watching my son finally confront the woman who'd been systematically deceiving him while isolating him from his family, I felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because Danny was finally showing the integrity and strength I'd raised him to possess. Sorrow because the confrontation was taking place in public, where Jessica's humiliation would become part of Riverside's collective memory and where the failure of their perfect marriage would be witnessed by the very people Jessica had been trying so desperately to impress. The carefully constructed facade Jessica had built around their relationship was crumbling in real time, and everyone involved understood that there would be no easy way to repair the damage that months of lies and financial recklessness had created. The perfect life Jessica had thrown away my family's memories to protect was revealing itself to be as fragile and temporary as the photographs she'd so carelessly discarded. But unlike the irreplaceable memories she'd destroyed, the consequences of her deceptions were entirely of her own making. She'd chosen lies over honesty, image over substance, and control over partnership. Now those choices were creating exactly the kind of public embarrassment and social isolation she'd been trying to avoid, while simultaneously destroying the marriage she'd been so determined to perfect. The war for my son's soul was entering its most critical phase, and Jessica was discovering that some battles couldn't be won through manipulation and deception. Truth had a way of emerging despite the most elaborate efforts to suppress it, and consequences had a way of finding people who thought they were clever enough to avoid them indefinitely. The weeks following the community center confrontation marked the beginning of what I privately called my Renaissance period. While Jessica scrambled to salvage her crumbling reputation and Danny wrestled with the reality of his wife's systematic deceptions, I found myself experiencing a freedom I hadn't felt since Bill's death. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around my daughter-in-law's preferences or modifying my behavior to accommodate her vision of how family relationships should function. The transformation started with small but significant changes to my daily routine. I began taking morning walks through downtown Riverside, stopping to chat with neighbors and shopkeepers I'd been neglecting while focused on preserving my precarious relationship with Danny and Jessica. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop on Main Street, commented on how relaxed I seemed compared to previous months when I'd appeared rushed and distracted during our brief encounters. "Maggie, you're practically glowing," she observed while arranging a bouquet of spring tulips that caught my eye. "Whatever you're doing differently, it's working for you." The comment made me realize that the stress of constantly managing Jessica's disapproval had been more visible than I'd understood. Liberating myself from the exhausting effort of earning her acceptance had apparently restored something essential that others could see even if I was just beginning to recognize it myself. I decided to redecorate my living room, not because anything was wrong with the existing furniture, but because I wanted to create a space that reflected my own tastes rather than what I thought others might find acceptable. For 3 years, I'd been subtly apologizing for my home's lived-in comfort whenever Jessica visited, seeing my accumulated possessions through her critical eyes instead of appreciating the memories and functionality they represented. Now I found myself embracing the eclectic mix of antiques, family photographs, and comfortable furniture that told the story of my life with Bill and Danny. The most significant purchase was an easel and art supplies that I set up in the bay window of my living room, claiming the best natural light in the house for watercolor painting. I'd abandoned art after Bill's death, telling myself I didn't have time for such luxuries when I was focused on supporting Danny through his grief and educational needs. But returning to painting felt like reclaiming a part of my identity that predated motherhood and widowhood, connecting me to the young woman who dreamed of becoming an art teacher before practical considerations led her toward more stable career choices. My sister Carol visited from Cincinnati during this period of personal renewal, ostensibly to help with some spring cleaning but really to assess my emotional state after months of family drama. She found me in the garden that Bill had designed, planting heirloom tomatoes and planning an herb garden that would provide fresh ingredients for the cooking experiments I'd been wanting to try. "You look like yourself again," Carol said, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs Bill had built for our 10th anniversary. "I was starting to worry that Jessica had completely beaten down your spirit, but you seem stronger than you've been in years." Her observation prompted a conversation about how accommodating someone else's unreasonable demands had gradually eroded my sense of self-worth and personal agency. I spent so much energy trying to be the kind of mother-in-law Jessica could accept that I forgot to be the kind of person I could respect, I admitted while transplanting seedlings into larger containers. When she threw away my wedding photos, she inadvertently freed me from the impossible task of earning approval from someone who was determined to find me inadequate regardless of my efforts. Carol helped me organize Bill's workshop, a project I'd been avoiding since his death because it felt like dismantling the last physical evidence of his presence in our home. But working alongside my sister to sort through his tools and unfinished projects became a celebration of his craftsmanship, rather than a painful reminder of loss. We discovered a half-completed rocking chair that Bill had been building for future grandchildren, along with detailed plans and measurements written in his careful handwriting. "He would have wanted Danny to finish this," Carol said, running her fingers over the smooth curve of the chair's arm. "Maybe when your son comes to his senses about Jessica, he'll want to connect with his father's work in a more meaningful way than just owning his truck." The suggestion planted a seed of possibility that grew stronger as I considered how Bill's workshop could become a bridge for rebuilding my relationship with Danny once he was ready to prioritize genuine connections over Jessica's manufactured perfection. During this period of personal growth, I maintained careful distance from Danny and Jessica's marital crisis, resisting the maternal instinct to offer advice or intervention. Instead, I focused on creating a stable, welcoming environment that Danny could access whenever he was ready to seek support. I stocked my refrigerator with his favorite foods, left the porch light on during evenings when I thought he might stop by, and made it clear through mutual friends that my door was always open without pressure or judgment. The strategy proved more effective than direct involvement would have been. Danny began making brief visits to my house, initially under the pretense of checking on maintenance issues or borrowing tools, but gradually staying longer for conversations that revealed his growing awareness of his marriage's fundamental problems. During one particularly honest discussion, he admitted that Jessica's lies about her employment had been just the beginning of a series of revelations that had shaken his trust in their entire relationship. "I found out she's been monitoring my phone calls and reading my emails," Danny confessed during a Saturday afternoon visit that had stretched into dinner. "She justified it by saying she was protecting our relationship from outside influences, but it feels like surveillance rather than partnership. I can't even talk to my own mother without wondering if Jessica will interrogate me about the conversation." Afterward, the admission revealed the extent of Jessica's control tactics and explained why our phone conversations had become so stilted and superficial. Danny had been self-censoring to avoid his wife's jealous suspicions about our relationship, gradually cutting himself off from family support to prevent domestic conflict. The isolation Jessica had created wasn't just social, it was emotional and psychological, designed to make Danny completely dependent on her approval and perspective. "How long has this been going on?" I asked gently, wanting to understand the timeline of Jessica's controlling behavior without seeming to interrogate Danny about his marriage choices. The question prompted him to reflect on patterns he'd been rationalizing or ignoring for months. "I think it started during our engagement," he said slowly, working through memories with newfound clarity. "She would get upset if I made plans with friends without consulting her first, or if I talked about family traditions she wasn't part of. I thought she was just being romantic, wanting to spend all our time together, but looking back, I can see how she was systematically cutting me off from other relationships." The conversation continued over dinner, with Danny sharing examples of Jessica's manipulative behavior that he'd previously dismissed as quirky preferences or reasonable boundaries. Her insistence on managing their social calendar to exclude people she deemed unsuitable. Her habit of scheduling activities during times when Danny might otherwise visit family or old friends. Her subtle but persistent criticism of anyone who remembered Danny before their relationship, including childhood friends, college roommates, and especially me. "She made me feel guilty for missing Dad," Danny admitted with tears in his eyes. "She said that dwelling on his memory was preventing me from fully committing to our future together." She convinced me that keeping his tools and visiting his grave were signs of emotional immaturity rather than healthy ways of honoring his influence on my life. The revelation about Jessica's interference with Danny's grief process was perhaps the most damaging aspect of her controlling behavior. Healthy relationships support partners through loss and change. They don't demand the elimination of meaningful connections to deceased loved ones. By forcing Danny to choose between honoring his father's memory and pleasing his wife, Jessica had created an impossible situation that guaranteed emotional damage regardless of his decision. Your father's influence on your life isn't something you should have to apologize for or hide, I said firmly. The values he taught you, the skills he shared, the love he showed you, those are gifts that should enhance your future relationships, not threaten them. Any woman who truly loves you would want to understand and appreciate the experiences that shaped you into the man she fell in love with. The statement seemed to provide Danny with perspective he'd been lacking during his marriage. For months, he'd been accepting Jessica's premise that his past was an obstacle to their happiness rather than questioning why she found his history so threatening. Her systematic efforts to erase his connections to family, friends, and memories suggested insecurity and possessiveness rather than love and commitment. Our conversation was interrupted by Jessica's arrival at my house, her expression tight with barely controlled anger as she confronted what she clearly viewed as unauthorized mother-son bonding. She'd been looking for Danny after he'd failed to return home at his expected time, and discovering him sharing dinner and honest conversation with me triggered the controlling response that had become her default reaction to situations she couldn't manage. Danny, I've been calling you for 2 hours, Jessica said without acknowledging my presence or greeting. We had plans to look at new furniture for the guest bedroom, and you disappeared without explanation. The accusation was delivered with the tone of someone addressing a misbehaving child rather than discussing scheduling conflicts with an adult partner. I told you I was coming to check on Mom's leaky faucet, Danny replied with a defensiveness that revealed how accustomed he'd become to justifying his whereabouts to his wife. I didn't realize I needed to provide hourly updates about my location when I'm visiting my own mother. The response was more assertive than Jessica had probably expected, suggesting that their recent marital conflicts had begun affecting Danny's willingness to accommodate her controlling demands. Jessica's reaction was swift and telling. Instead of apologizing for her aggressive tone or acknowledging that Danny had every right to spend time with family members, she escalated the confrontation by challenging his priorities and loyalty. It's interesting how you always have time for your mother but can't commit to the plans we make together as a married couple. Maybe you need to decide whether you're more committed to your past or your future. The ultimatum was a tactical error that revealed Jessica's fundamental misunderstanding of healthy relationship dynamics. By forcing Danny to choose between family loyalty and marital harmony, she was creating exactly the kind of conflict that would eventually destroy rather than strengthen their partnership. Secure spouses encourage their partner's family relationships rather than competing with them for primary loyalty. This isn't about choosing between you and Mom, Danny said with growing frustration. This is about having the freedom to maintain relationships that were important to me before we got married. You're treating every conversation with my family like it's a betrayal of our marriage, and that's not healthy for any of us. The exchange continued for several more minutes, with Jessica becoming increasingly agitated as Danny refused to apologize for spending time with me or promise to limit future family interactions. Her mask of sophisticated control was slipping, revealing the insecure, possessive woman beneath the carefully constructed facade. When Danny finally announced that he wasn't ready to leave and suggested Jessica return home without him, her response was both predictable and devastating to her remaining credibility. Fine, but don't expect me to keep defending your family relationships to my parents when they ask why you're so dependent on your mother's approval, Jessica snapped before storming out of my house. They already think it's weird how much time you spend talking about your dead father and analyzing every decision with someone who clearly has no understanding of modern marriage dynamics. The parting shot was intended to wound both Danny and me, but it actually provided valuable insight into Jessica's campaign against our family relationships. She'd been actively undermining Danny's connections to his deceased father and living mother through conversations with her own family, creating an echo chamber that reinforced her perspective while isolating Danny from alternative viewpoints. The manipulation was more systematic and calculated than I'd even suspected. After Jessica's departure, Danny sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the implications of his wife's final comments. The revelation that she'd been discussing their private marital conflicts with her parents while portraying his family relationships as pathological seemed to shock him more than her previous lies about employment and finances. I can't believe she's been telling her parents that I'm too dependent on you, Danny finally said, his voice hollow with betrayal. And the way she talked about Dad, like missing him is some kind of character flaw rather than natural grief. What kind of person tries to make someone feel guilty for loving their deceased parent? The question hung in the air between us, highlighting the fundamental incompatibility between Jessica's vision of marriage and the values Danny had been raised to embrace. Her need to be the exclusive source of love, support, and identity in her husband's life wasn't romantic, it was pathological. Healthy relationships expand people's capacity for connection rather than requiring them to abandon existing bonds to prove their commitment. Over the following weeks, Danny began visiting more frequently, often bringing specific problems or decisions he wanted to discuss without Jessica's input or interference. The conversations revealed a man who'd been second-guessing his own judgment. For months, constantly filtering his thoughts and preferences through his wife's expressed opinions before trusting his own instincts. Jessica's controlling behavior had been so pervasive that Danny had begun losing confidence in his ability to make independent decisions about everything from career choices to household purchases. The breakthrough moment came when Danny discovered Jessica's secret credit card debt, accumulated through months of maintaining her appearance of financial success while unemployed. The debt was substantial enough to require immediate action, but Jessica's response to Danny's discovery was to blame him for not earning enough money to support her lifestyle rather than acknowledging her own deceptive spending patterns. She told me that if I was a better provider, she wouldn't have needed to use credit cards to maintain our social standing, Danny reported during one of our evening conversations. According to Jessica, the debt is actually my fault because I haven't been ambitious enough about advancing my career to match her family's expectations for our standard of living. The victim-blaming response was classic manipulation, designed to deflect responsibility while making Danny feel guilty for circumstances beyond his control. Jessica's unemployment and subsequent financial deception were her choices, not the inevitable result of Danny's inadequate earning potential. By shifting blame to her husband, she was attempting to avoid accountability while maintaining her position as the injured party in their relationship. "Danny, you have a good job with steady income and excellent benefits," I reminded him. "The financial problems in your marriage aren't caused by insufficient earnings, they're caused by dishonest spending and unrealistic lifestyle expectations. No amount of career advancement will solve problems created by deception and poor judgment." The conversation helped Danny recognize that Jessica's financial demands were moving targets designed to keep him perpetually insecure about his adequacy as a provider. Every raise or promotion would simply lead to higher expectations and more elaborate spending, because the underlying issue wasn't money but control. Jessica needed Danny to feel financially inadequate so she could maintain the upper hand in their relationship through constant criticism and impossible standards. As spring turned to summer, I watched my son gradually reclaim the confidence and independence that Jessica's manipulations had eroded. He began making decisions without seeking his wife's approval first, reconnecting with friends she deemed unsuitable, and expressing opinions that contradicted her preferences without immediately backing down. The changes were subtle but significant, representing a man who was remembering what it felt like to trust his own judgment rather than deferring to someone else's supposedly superior wisdom. The transformation wasn't without consequences. Jessica responded to Danny's growing independence with escalating attempts to reassert control, including threats to leave him if he couldn't commit fully to their marriage as she defined it. But instead of panicking and capitulating as he might have done months earlier, Danny began evaluating whether preserving their relationship was worth the cost in personal freedom and family connections. During one particularly honest conversation, Danny admitted that he'd been considering separation as a way of creating space to evaluate their marriage without the constant pressure of Jessica's emotional manipulation. "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly trying to meet someone else's expectations," he said. "I've been so focused on being the husband Jessica wanted that I've forgotten what kind of man I actually want to be." The admission represented a crucial step in Danny's journey back to emotional health and authentic relationships. For the first time since his marriage, he was prioritizing his own growth and well-being rather than sacrificing everything to maintain domestic peace. Jessica's systematic destruction of his family connections and personal autonomy had finally pushed him to a breaking point that demanded change rather than continued accommodation. As I watched my son struggle to reclaim his identity from a marriage that had required him to abandon essential parts of himself, I felt both pride in his emerging strength and sadness for the pain he was enduring. Jessica's manipulation had been so thorough that Danny's recovery would require time, support, and considerable courage. But the foundations of character that Bill and I had tried to instill were proving stronger than Jessica's attempts to reshape him according to her specifications. The perfect life she'd thrown away my family memories to protect was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions and deceptions. Unlike the irreplaceable photographs she'd carelessly discarded, however, the damage she'd done to her marriage was entirely self-inflicted and potentially reparable if she could find the humility to acknowledge her mistakes and the courage to change her controlling behavior. But given everything I'd observed about Jessica's character, such fundamental transformation seemed unlikely, leaving Danny to choose between continued imprisonment in a toxic relationship or the difficult but necessary work of rebuilding his life on authentic foundations. The final confrontation came on a humid Tuesday evening in late August when Jessica arrived at my house unannounced, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained desperation. Danny had moved into the guest bedroom at their townhouse 3 weeks earlier, citing his need for space to think about their marriage, and Jessica's attempts to regain control had become increasingly frantic and irrational. She'd tried everything from romantic gestures to ultimatums, but Danny's growing independence had proven resistant to her traditional manipulation tactics. "We need to talk," Jessica announced without waiting for an invitation, pushing past me into my living room where she immediately began pacing like a caged animal. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her usually perfect hair showed signs of nervous handling, and her makeup couldn't quite conceal the dark circles under her eyes that suggested weeks of poor sleep and mounting stress. "This situation has gone far enough, and I'm tired of pretending that you haven't been poisoning Danny against me since the day we met." The accusation was delivered with the righteous indignation of someone who genuinely believed her own revisionist history, despite overwhelming evidence of her manipulative behavior throughout their marriage. In Jessica's mind, the collapse of her perfect life was somehow my fault rather than the natural consequence of years of lies, financial deception, and systematic isolation of her husband from meaningful relationships. She'd convinced herself that Danny's growing independence was the result of my interference rather than his own delayed recognition of unhealthy dynamics. "Jessica, I think you're giving me far more credit than I deserve," I replied calmly, gesturing for her to sit down while I remained standing near the window where my easel held a half-finished watercolor of Bill's garden. "Danny is an adult who's capable of making his own decisions about his marriage and his relationships. If he's questioning things now, perhaps you should consider why rather than looking for someone else to blame." The reasonable response seemed to infuriate Jessica further, probably because she'd been expecting either defensiveness or capitulation that would allow her to control the direction of our conversation. Instead, my calm acceptance of her accusations forced her to confront the possibility that her problems couldn't be solved by eliminating my influence from Danny's life. The issues in their marriage ran deeper than any external interference could have created. "Don't act innocent with me," Jessica snapped, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested genuine panic underneath her anger. "I know you've been filling his head with stories about how wonderful your marriage was, making him compare everything to some impossible standard based on ancient history. Danny was perfectly happy until you started undermining our relationship with your constant reminiscing about his dead father." The attack on my marriage and Bill's memory crossed a line that I hadn't expected Jessica to breach, even in her current state of desperation. Her willingness to weaponize my grief and our family's loss revealed a cruelty that went beyond simple selfishness or immaturity. She was deliberately targeting the most vulnerable aspects of my emotional life because she understood that honoring Bill's memory remained central to my identity and my relationship with Danny. "My marriage to Bill wasn't perfect, Jessica," I said quietly, maintaining my composure despite the provocation. "We had our struggles, our disagreements, and our moments of doubt like any couple. What we also had was mutual respect, honest communication, and the understanding that loving someone means supporting their growth rather than trying to control their every thought and relationship. Those aren't impossible standards, they're basic requirements for healthy partnerships." The comparison was implicit but unmistakable, and Jessica's reaction confirmed that she understood exactly what I was suggesting about her own approach to marriage. Her face flushed with anger and embarrassment as she realized that her manipulative tactics were being contrasted unfavorably with the genuine partnership Bill and I had shared. Rather than defending her behavior or acknowledging its problems, she escalated her attack by targeting my competence as a mother. "You raised a son who can't commit to his own wife because he's too attached to his mother's opinions," Jessica accused, her voice trembling with rage. "Danny can't make a single decision without running to you for approval first. That's not healthy parenting, that's emotional manipulation that's destroyed his ability to function as an independent adult in his own marriage." The irony of Jessica accusing me of emotional manipulation while simultaneously trying to control Danny's family relationships through threats and ultimatums was apparently lost on her. She'd spent 3 years systematically isolating my son from external support systems, monitoring his communications, and demanding exclusive access to his emotional life, yet she was characterizing my willingness to listen and offer perspective as the manipulative behavior that threatened their marriage. Jessica, when Danny comes to me for advice, I encourage him to think through his options and make his own choices, I replied firmly. I don't tell him what to do, and I don't make his decisions for him. I provide a safe space where he can process his thoughts without judgment or pressure. That's what supportive relationships look like, whether they're between parents and children, friends, or spouses. The contrast between my approach and Jessica's controlling demands was becoming increasingly obvious, even to someone as self-deceptive as my daughter-in-law had proven to be. Danny sought out conversations with me because they helped him clarify his own thinking, not because I imposed my will on his decision-making process. Jessica, on the other hand, had been trying to eliminate any input that might challenge her perspective or authority within their marriage. I want you to tell Danny that he needs to choose between his marriage and his obsession with this family, Jessica demanded, apparently believing she could recruit me as an ally in her campaign to isolate my son. He can't have both a successful marriage and this unhealthy attachment to people who refuse to let him grow up and move forward with his life. If you really love him, you'll help him understand that he needs to prioritize his future over his past. The request was breathtakingly audacious in its assumption that I would participate in my own elimination from Danny's life. Jessica apparently expected me to validate her characterization of our relationship as unhealthy while supporting her ultimatum that Danny choose between family loyalty and marital harmony. The demand revealed both her desperation and her fundamental misunderstanding of love as something that requires sacrifice of other meaningful connections rather than enhancement of them. I'm not going to encourage Danny to choose between his marriage and his family, I said definitively. Healthy relationships don't require such choices because they're based on addition rather than subtraction. A wife who truly loves her husband wants him to have strong family bonds because those connections enrich his life and, by extension, their partnership. Your demand that Danny choose between us suggests that you view love as a limited resource rather than something that grows stronger when it's shared. The explanation seemed to strike Jessica like a physical blow, probably because it articulated something she'd been denying about her own approach to marriage. Her need for exclusive control over Danny's emotional life wasn't romantic, it was possessive and destructive. By forcing him to choose between his wife and his family, she was creating exactly the kind of impossible situation that guaranteed resentment and eventual rebellion. You don't understand modern marriage, Jessica shot back, grasping for any argument that might invalidate my perspective. Your generation stayed together no matter how miserable you were because divorce was shameful. My generation expects more from our relationships, and that includes spouses who prioritize each other over everyone else, including their parents. The generational argument was a deflection that avoided addressing the specific controlling behaviors that had characterized Jessica's marriage while positioning her demands as somehow progressive rather than regressive. Healthy marriages in any era were built on mutual support and respect rather than isolation and control. Jessica's expectations weren't more sophisticated than previous generations, they were more narcissistic. Jessica, expecting your spouse to prioritize your relationship doesn't mean demanding that they abandon all other meaningful connections, I replied patiently. Mature love enhances people's capacity for relationship rather than restricting it. When you insist that Danny choose between loving you and maintaining family bonds, you're asking him to diminish himself rather than grow into a fuller version of who he could become. The conversation was interrupted by Danny's arrival, his key turning in my front door with the familiar ease of someone who'd never needed permission to enter his childhood home. He stopped short when he saw Jessica standing in my living room, her agitated state immediately apparent despite her attempts to compose herself upon his entrance. The tension between them was palpable, suggesting that their separation hadn't been as amicable as Danny had initially indicated. Jessica, what are you doing here? Danny asked with the wary tone of someone who'd learned to be cautious about his wife's unexpected appearances. I told you I needed space to think things through without pressure or manipulation. Confronting my mother at her house doesn't exactly respect those boundaries. The observation was delivered calmly but firmly, indicating that Danny's time away from their shared home had strengthened his ability to recognize and resist Jessica's controlling tactics. Rather than apologizing for her intrusion or acknowledging his legitimate request for space, Jessica immediately went on the offensive with accusations designed to make Danny feel guilty for asserting his independence. I'm here because your mother has been systematically destroying our marriage since the day we met, Jessica declared with the dramatic flair of someone who'd been rehearsing her grievances. She's filled your head with impossible expectations based on her ancient marriage to your father, made you feel guilty for prioritizing our relationship over family traditions, and convinced you that I'm somehow the problem when I'm the only one trying to help you move forward with your life. The litany of accusations revealed the depth of Jessica's denial about her own role in their marital problems. In her mind, Every instance of Danny questioning her behavior or asserting his independence was evidence of my manipulation rather than his natural response to being controlled and deceived. She'd constructed an elaborate narrative that painted her as the victim of interference rather than the architect of her own romantic downfall. Danny's response was measured but devastating in its clarity. "Jessica, my mother didn't convince me that you've been lying about your employment for 6 months. My mother didn't force you to hide credit card debt or monitor my phone calls or try to cut me off from my friends. My mother didn't make you throw away irreplaceable family photos because they didn't match your decorating scheme. You did all of those things yourself, and now you're trying to blame someone else for the consequences of your own choices." The systematic listing of Jessica's deceptive and controlling behaviors seemed to shock her into momentary silence. Probably because hearing them enumerated so clearly made their cumulative impact undeniable. Each individual incident might have been rationalized or explained away, but taken together they revealed a pattern of manipulation that couldn't be dismissed as miscommunication or different priorities. "Everything I did was to protect our marriage from interference and help you focus on our future together," Jessica protested, her voice rising with desperation. "If you can't see that my actions came from love rather than manipulation, then maybe your mother has succeeded in poisoning you against me more completely than I realized." The defense was both revealing and pathetic in its refusal to acknowledge Danny's agency in recognizing unhealthy relationship dynamics. Jessica couldn't accept that her husband might have legitimate concerns about her behavior, so she attributed his growing independence to external manipulation rather than internal growth. The explanation protected her from having to confront her own controlling tendencies while positioning herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. "Jessica, love doesn't require deception, financial irresponsibility, or isolation from family and friends," Danny replied with a sadness that suggested genuine grief for what their marriage might have been under different circumstances. "Love doesn't involve monitoring someone's communications or demanding that they choose between their spouse and their family. What you're describing isn't love, it's possession, and I can't continue living that way." The declaration seemed to drain the fight out of Jessica, her rigid posture collapsing as she realized that her desperate attempt to blame me for their marital problems had failed to convince the one person whose opinion actually mattered. Danny's growing clarity about healthy relationship dynamics meant that her traditional manipulation tactics were no longer effective, leaving her without the tools she'd relied on to maintain control throughout their marriage. "So that's it?" Jessica whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "You're choosing your mother over your wife? You're throwing away our marriage because I made some mistakes while trying to build a perfect life for us?" The characterization of systematic deception and manipulation as mere mistakes revealed how little Jessica understood about the severity of her behavior or the damage it had caused to their relationship. "I'm choosing honesty over deception and autonomy over control," Danny corrected gently. "I'm choosing a version of myself that doesn't have to walk on eggshells or apologize for loving my family or hide my thoughts and feelings from the person who's supposed to be my closest ally." "You didn't make some mistakes, Jessica. You created an entire relationship dynamic based on lies and manipulation, and I can't keep pretending that's acceptable." The conversation continued for another hour, with Jessica alternating between tearful pleas for reconciliation and angry accusations about my interference in their marriage. But Danny remained steadfast in his decision to prioritize his own emotional health over her demands for unconditional submission to her vision of their relationship. When Jessica finally left my house, it was with the understanding that their marriage was ending not because of external interference but because of fundamental incompatibilities that couldn't be resolved through compromise or counseling. In the weeks that followed, Danny began the difficult process of rebuilding his life on foundations of honesty and authentic relationship. He moved back into his childhood bedroom temporarily while searching for an apartment that would allow him to establish independence from both his mother and his estranged wife. The arrangement gave us opportunities for conversations that gradually repaired the damage Jessica's manipulation had caused to our own relationship. "I'm sorry I let her convince me that staying close to you was somehow unhealthy," Danny said during one of our evening talks on the front porch where Bill used to read the newspaper after work. "I knew something felt wrong about cutting off contact with family and friends, but I kept telling myself that marriage required sacrifices and that maybe I just needed to adjust my expectations." The apology wasn't necessary, but it revealed how completely Jessica had succeeded in making Danny doubt his own instincts about healthy relationship dynamics. Her systematic campaign to isolate him from external perspectives had been so effective that he'd begun questioning the value of connections that had previously been sources of strength and stability in his life. "Danny, you were trying to make your marriage work by accommodating your wife's demands," I replied, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "That's a noble impulse, even when it's misguided. The problem wasn't your willingness to compromise. It was Jessica's inability to appreciate the difference between reasonable accommodation and complete capitulation to someone else's control. Over the following months, Danny's confidence and independence gradually returned as he rebuilt connections that Jessica had systematically undermined. He reconciled with college friends who'd been excluded from their social circle, returned to hobbies and interests that Jessica had deemed immature or impractical, and began making decisions based on his own values rather than someone else's expectations. The transformation was remarkable to witness, like watching a plant recover from near-fatal neglect once it received proper care and attention. The divorce proceedings were finalized the following spring, with Jessica fighting bitterly over asset division despite her own deceptive financial behavior having contributed significantly to their marital debt. She attempted to claim half the value of Bill's restored pickup truck, apparently viewing it as a valuable asset rather than the sentimental family heirloom it represented. Danny's refusal to negotiate on that particular item seemed to surprise her, as if she still expected him to prioritize avoiding conflict over protecting things that mattered to him. She actually seemed shocked that I wouldn't give up Dad's truck to make the divorce easier, Danny reported after a particularly contentious mediation session. I think she still doesn't understand that some things are more important than keeping the peace or avoiding uncomfortable conversations. That truck represents my connection to Dad's values and work ethic. No amount of money could replace what it means to me. The truck became a symbol of Danny's recovery from Jessica's controlling influence, representing his renewed ability to prioritize meaningful connections over superficial harmony. When he began spending weekends in Bill's workshop, learning to use the tools his father had carefully maintained and working on the unfinished rocking chair we'd discovered months earlier, it felt like watching him reclaim essential parts of his identity that Jessica had forced him to suppress. "I want to finish this for Dad," Danny said one Saturday afternoon as he sanded the chair's curved rockers with the same patient attention to detail that Bill had always demonstrated. "Maybe someday I'll have children who can use it, and they'll know that their grandfather built it even though he never got to meet them." The statement revealed Danny's restored appreciation for family continuity and the ways that love transcends individual lifetimes through craftsmanship, stories, and shared values. As Danny healed from his toxic marriage and I continued my own journey of personal rediscovery, we developed a new relationship dynamic based on mutual respect and genuine friendship rather than the caretaking patterns that had characterized our interaction during his adolescence and early adulthood. He sought my perspective on important decisions not because he couldn't think for himself, but because he valued my experience and trusted my judgment. I offered support and advice when requested while respecting his autonomy and independence as an adult man capable of managing his own life. The contrast with Jessica's approach to relationship couldn't have been more stark. Where she had demanded exclusive access to Danny's emotional life while providing manipulation and deception in return, I offered unconditional support while encouraging his growth and independence. Where she had viewed his family connections as threats to their marriage, I celebrated his expanding capacity for meaningful relationship as evidence of emotional maturity and health. 2 years after Jessica's final confrontation in my living room, Danny met Sarah, a kindergarten teacher, whose warmth and authenticity provided a stark contrast to his ex-wife's superficial sophistication. Sarah's first visit to my house included genuine curiosity about family photos, enthusiastic appreciation for stories about Danny's childhood, and respectful questions about Bill's influence on our family's values. When I showed her the hope chest Bill had built for our first anniversary, she understood immediately why Jessica's destruction of my wedding photos had been so devastating. "I can't imagine throwing away someone's irreplaceable memories," Sarah said, running her fingers over the intricate rose carvings on the chest's lid. "These photographs were part of Danny's history too. Destroying them was like trying to erase the love story that created him." The observation revealed an understanding of family continuity that Jessica had never possessed, along with the emotional intelligence to recognize how individual histories contribute to current relationships rather than threatening them. When Danny and Sarah announced their engagement, they asked me to help plan their wedding with the understanding that family traditions and personal history would be celebrated rather than hidden or minimized. Sarah wanted to incorporate elements that honored Bill's memory and our family's values, viewing the past as a foundation for their future rather than an obstacle to overcome. The contrast with Jessica's approach to marriage couldn't have been more complete or more encouraging. The wedding itself was everything Danny's first marriage ceremony hadn't been: intimate, authentic, and focused on the commitment being made rather than the impression being created. Sarah wore my grandmother's pearl necklace as her something old, acknowledging the generations of love that had contributed to the moment she was sharing with my son. When Danny spoke his vows, he referenced the example of partnership and mutual Respect that Bill and I had modeled, crediting our marriage with teaching him what genuine love looked like. During the reception, Sarah made a point of asking me to share stories about Bill and our early years together, creating space for my memories rather than feeling threatened by them. When guests toasted the couple's future, she raised her glass to honor the past that had shaped them both, understanding that acknowledging previous relationships and influences strengthened rather than weakened their own connection. As I watched Danny dance with his new wife, both of them glowing with happiness that seemed to radiate from deep contentment rather than surface performance, I thought about Jessica's destructive belief that love required elimination of competing loyalties. Her need to erase my family's history to create room for her perfect life had ultimately destroyed the very relationship she'd been trying to protect. By demanding that Danny choose between his past and his future, she'd forced him to recognize that authentic love doesn't require such impossible choices. The photographs Jessica had thrown away would never be replaced, but the love story they'd documented lived on through the values they'd represented and the lessons they'd taught about partnership, respect, and genuine commitment. Danny's ability to create a healthy marriage with Sarah proved that his father's influence hadn't been diminished by Jessica's attempts to erase it, and that family traditions could enhance rather than threaten new relationships when they were approached with wisdom and appreciation. In the end, Jessica's perfect life had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and deceptions, while the authentic connections she tried to destroy had proven resilient enough to survive her manipulation and emerge stronger than before. The lesson was clear: relationships built on control and deception are as fragile as the lies that sustain them, while those founded on honesty and mutual respect can weather almost any storm and grow stronger through adversity. Standing in my garden on Danny and Sarah's first anniversary, watching them work together to plant memorial roses in honor of Bill's memory, I understood that love stories don't end with death or divorce. They continue through the values they instill and the connections they inspire. Jessica had thrown away my perfect life once, but she'd inadvertently created space for something even better, a future built on authenticity rather than illusion, substance rather than appearance, and love that multiplied rather than diminished when it was shared with others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.